Purchasing limits are one of the main tools that the state uses to ensure that cannabis products aren't oversold. Since these limits vary heavily from state to state, we came up with a highly configurable setup tool that allows you to easily adhere to your state's unique regulations. Setting up purchasing limits. Before we begin, it's important for you to acknowledge that IndicaOnline is not a regulatory authority, and thus cannot and does not give any advice on how limits should be set up in your state. Make sure to contact your state's cannabis regulatory body prior to setting them up. Purchasing limits can only be set up on IndicaOnline web. Navigate to Config, Purchasing Limits, to begin working with them. The first time you open this page, you'll only see a single toggle, Enable Purchasing Limits. When enabled, you'll see a bunch of new options appear. Let's go through the options one by one. Manager's PIN required. When enabled, this setting will prevent a sale that exceeds purchasing limits unless the manager's PIN or magnetic card is used to allow it. Decline sales on exceeded purchasing limit. When enabled, this setting will prevent a sale that exceeds purchasing limits from being processed entirely. You won't be able to process such sales unless you disable this setting. Keep in mind that if both settings are enabled, decline sales on exceeded purchasing limit will take priority and you won't be able to process the sale. Below the above-mentioned toggles, you'll find a calculation type selector. Here you can choose the calculation logic for your limits. And calculates limits individually, per indicated product type. Let's say I've got limits set up in the following way. 5 grams of flour and 5 grams of concentrate. Me buying 2 grams of flour will leave my limits with 3 grams of flour and 5 grams of concentrates, or calculates limits in a unified fashion, meaning that limits progression in one product type will reflect on all the others. So if we use the same limit, but with or instead, an example of this being 5 grams of flour or 5 grams of concentrates, me buying 2 grams of flour will leave me room to buy 3 grams of flour or 3 grams of concentrate. Custom allows you to split a rule into 2 subrules and provides the ability to mix and match calculation options. In this case, you'll be able to utilize both and/or calculation types. Let's say the limits are set up at 70 grams of marijuana, out of which 5 grams are equal to 5 grams of concentrates. So if I purchase 62 grams of marijuana and 2 grams of concentrates, I can buy 62 grams of marijuana or 3 grams of concentrates. The setup interface itself is quite simple and allows you to easily configure each aspect of the limit. The first thing you'll need to do is specify the limit name. Then you'll need to choose how it's calculated from the Calculate By dropdown. You can choose between unit, weight, TWCC, which is the total weight of the cannabis concentrates, and weight plus TWCC. After this, simply click the product type field and choose the desired product types from the dropdown. Once you've chosen the desired product types, it's time to select the period after which the limits will reset. You can choose between per month, per day, and per transaction. Once you've chosen the period, you can set the purchasable amount under the recreational box. Keep in mind that this box can be disabled entirely if you untick the checkbox next to it. The medical limits operates the same exact way. If you want the refresh period for medical and recreational limits to be separate, you can click the clock icon next to the medical field to get an additional period dropdown for it. Clicking on the icon that looks like a stack of lines will add a subrule, allowing you to add information for the unit of measurement, product categories, and the actual limit for the subrules.